0200. A corridor lit only by a single overhead strip, humming the way old wiring hums when it's tired of holding on. The light flickers. Once, twice, a third time. And then it dies. And for 17 minutes, the dark belongs to something else. Somewhere else, on a different base, a sergeant is counting his formation. 32 men assigned. He counts 33. The extra one is standing at the back of the line, perfectly still, slightly out of focus no matter how hard you look at him. Good evening, Midnight members. There is a particular kind of fear that belongs only to soldiers. It isn't the fear of combat or the fear of the enemy across the wire. It's quieter than that. It's the fear of a base that's too old, too occupied, too soaked in the years of men who came before you and never quite left. It's the fear of routine interrupted. A light that shouldn't go out. A footstep where no one should be walking. A face in a formation that wasn't there yesterday. Tonight, we're going overseas. Forward operating bases in the Middle East, abandoned corridors, perimeter wire walked by men who died defending it. Tonight, we're talking about the things that wait in uniform. Get comfortable. Lower the lights if you can stand it. Welcome to Mr. Bones' Midnight Society, episode 19. Now, let the nightmares begin. Nobody talked about him during the day. That's the part that still gets me. 32 men on that base, and not one of us brought it up before sundown. It was like some unspoken rule we'd all agreed to without a meeting, without a memo. You didn't mention the soldier on the perimeter until you absolutely had to. And even then, you kept your voice low. My name is Corporal Daniel Reyes, and I was stationed at FOB Caldwell in 2009. It was a small forward operating base, just enough infrastructure to feel permanent, not enough to feel safe. We were in a valley between two ridgelines, surrounded by flat, pale dust that turned everything the same washed-out color by noon. The mountains in the distance always looked like they were watching us. I stopped looking back at them after the first month. There's something about mountains at that distance, in that kind of light. You can't tell if they're 5 miles away or 50. They just sit there, permanent and indifferent. And after a while, you stop trying to measure them. The base itself was fine. Standard layout, standard routines. We had a small chow hall that smelled like reconstituted eggs, no matter what was actually being served. 2 rows of containerized living units where you could hear your neighbors breathing through the walls. A motor pool full of vehicles that needed more attention than we had time to give them. A comm shack that lost signal during sandstorms, and a perimeter of HESCO barriers topped with concertina wire. Guard towers at each corner. Plywood floors, sandbag walls, a mounted light, and a radio that worked maybe 60% of the time. Floodlights on the outside of the barriers that worked even less. Nothing unusual. Nothing that should have made any of us feel the way we eventually did. Just a base. Just dust. Just the long, flat nothing of a deployment that hadn't really started yet. It started with Kowalski. He was on first watch, maybe 2 weeks into our deployment. Middle of October. The nights had started getting cold fast. That desert cold that doesn't warn you, just arrives. Kowalski came off his shift at 0200 and went straight to the comm shack instead of his bunk, which was unusual. He asked Sergeant Morrow if anyone had been added to the patrol rotation without the board being updated. Morrow told him no. Why? Kowalski said there was someone walking the wire. Not unusual by itself. We had scheduled patrols, guys checking the perimeter at irregular intervals. Standard practice. But Kowalski said this guy had been walking the same western stretch for his entire 2-hour shift. Same path, same pace. Back and forth, back and forth. Never stopping, never checking the wire, never pausing to look out into the darkness beyond the barriers the way a man on patrol would. Just walking, like the path itself was the point. Morrow asked if he'd challenged him. Kowalski said he'd tried, twice. The first time he called out from the tower. Standard challenge, the right words in the right order. Nothing. The figure didn't break stride. The second time Kowalski used his radio, called down to the patrol frequency, announced he had eyes on someone on the western stretch, and asked them to respond. Silence. And from the guard tower, with only the floodlights working on the east side that night, the western stretch was mostly shadow. Kowalski said he couldn't get a clear look, just the shape of a man. Desert fatigues. Moving like he knew exactly where he was going, even though he was going nowhere. The thing that rattled Kowalski most, he told me later, wasn't the silence. It was the pace. Never faster, never slower. Like a metronome, like something that didn't need to think about walking, because walking was all it did. Morrow logged it as a possible local national, possible equipment issue with the lights. He told Kowalski to get some sleep. But Kowalski didn't sleep. I know because his bunk was across from mine, and I heard him turn over all night, the metal frame creaking every 20 minutes or so, the sound of a man trying to talk himself down from something he didn't have language for yet. 2 days later, it was Martinez on watch. Then Okafor. Then a kid named Pruitt, who'd only been in country for 3 weeks. Each of them came off their shifts with the same story. Man on the western perimeter, walking the wire. Same stretch, same pace. Wouldn't respond to challenges. Wouldn't stop. By the end of the second week, we'd all seen him at least once. I had my first look on a Thursday. I remember because Thursday was the day we got mail, and I'd gotten a letter from my mother that I hadn't opened yet. It was in my vest pocket when I climbed up to the tower at 2300. My relief wasn't coming until 100. 2 hours of dark, cold, nothing. The floodlights on the west side were working that night. That was the first thing I noticed. They flickered on around 2330 and held, which almost never happened. And in that pale, yellow light, I saw him. He was walking the wire exactly the way Kowalski described. Measured steps, steady pace, desert fatigues, the older pattern, the kind we'd mostly phased out by that point. He was maybe 60 meters out, moving parallel to the HESCO barriers, heading south along the western edge. I watched him for a full minute before I raised my radio. Tower 2 to base, I've got eyes on one personnel walking the western perimeter. Can you confirm rotation? The response came back fast. Tower 2, no rotation on the western side at this time. Say again your contact. I described him. Fatigues, medium build, steady walk, heading south. No visible weapon in hand, though I couldn't see his rig clearly from the angle. Tower 2, hold position. We're checking. I kept watching him. He reached the southern corner of the western stretch, where the HESCO barrier made a 90-degree turn east, and he stopped. Just stopped. Stood there with his back to me. The floodlight was directly above him, and I could see the detail on his uniform, the stitching at the shoulders, the worn fabric across the back. He was real. He was solid. He was standing 10 meters from the wire, and I could have thrown a stone and hit him. Then he turned around. I've tried to explain what I felt in that moment to people who weren't there, and I can't do it right. It wasn't that his face was wrong, or that he was missing a face, or anything like the stories people tell. It was subtler than that. It was the way he turned. Too slow. Not like a man who'd heard something and was reacting. More like a man who'd simply decided it was time to face the other direction, and was doing it at his own pace, entirely unbothered by the fact that I was staring at him from a tower with a rifle. He looked up at me. The radio crackled. Tower 2, we have no personnel on the western perimeter. Tower 2, can you still see contact? I keyed my radio. Affirmative, he's at the southern corner. The floodlights went out. All of them. Every light on the western side simultaneously, like something had pulled a plug on the whole stretch. The darkness came down so fast it felt physical, like a door slamming, like a hand over your eyes. 1 second I was looking at a man in clear yellow light, and the next second there was nothing, just black, and the pale geometry of the HESCO barriers barely visible against the slightly less dark sky beyond them. Tower 2, status? I couldn't answer for a moment. My hand was on the radio, but I wasn't pressing anything. I was just standing there, staring at the place where he'd been standing, waiting for my eyes to adjust to something they weren't going to adjust to. There was nothing out there, nothing I could see. But I was listening. Because in the silence after the lights died, in that specific slice of a second before the generator noise filled back in and the bass sounds reasserted themselves, the distant rumble of the motor pool, the hum of the comm shack equipment, the ordinary sounds of 32 men sleeping and eating and existing. In that slice of silence, I heard footsteps. Slow, steady. The crunch of packed dirt and gravel, measured and unhurried. Moving north along the western wall, getting closer to the tower. Tower 2, please respond. The footsteps kept coming. Same pace, same rhythm. I pressed myself against the rear wall of the tower, away from the rail, and I held my breath, and I listened to them come closer and closer, and then they stopped, directly below me. I know it was directly below me because the sound was centered under my feet, and then it was gone, like a switch, like the lights. Silence. Tower 2, please respond. I'm here, I said. My voice was flat and strange in my own ears. Contact is no longer visible. I didn't sleep that night. I don't think anyone expected me to. It was Lieutenant Ferris who finally pulled the base records. He was methodical like that. Not superstitious, not spooked. Just the kind of officer who believed that if something was happening, there was a reason, and the reason was usually in the paperwork. He spent 2 days going through the base's history of occupancy, talking to our battalion S2, making calls I wasn't privy to. He called a small meeting. Just the senior NCOs and a few of us who'd had direct contact. He didn't say much. He set a printed photograph on the table, black and white, old resolution, the kind of image that comes off a microfiche scan. He asked if anyone recognized the uniform. We all did. It was the older pattern, the one the figure on the perimeter wore. The man in the photograph was standing at attention, somewhere desert, somewhere that looked like it could have been our base or a dozen like it. He was looking directly at the camera with the flat, patient expression of someone who'd stood for a lot of photographs. Ferris said his name was Speck, Aaron Dillard. He'd been stationed at Phobe Caldwell, or the earlier iteration of it, in 1997, during a much smaller, quieter deployment none of us had heard much about. He'd been on a perimeter patrol one night when something happened. The records were vague. The official cause of death was listed as an accident. He was 24 years old. Nobody said anything for a long time. Then Kowalski asked, very quietly, what part of the perimeter Dillard had been patrolling when it happened. Ferris looked down at the file. "Western side," he said. We never stopped seeing him. That's the part I want to be honest about, because I've heard people tell these stories and they always end with the haunting going quiet, or someone doing a ritual, or the unit packing up and leaving. We didn't leave. We had a mission, and we stayed for 9 more months after that first sighting, and Speck. Aaron Dillard walked his stretch of wire every single night we were there. But we adjusted. Unofficially, quietly, the way soldiers adjust to everything they can't file a report about. Nobody assigned to the Western Tower challenged the figure anymore after the 2nd month. Nobody radioed it in. There was no announcement, no decision made in a meeting. It just stopped happening by consensus. You climbed up, you did your 2 hours, and if the lights on the west side happened to work, and you happened to see a man in old fatigues walking the wire at his own pace, unbothered and unhurried, you let him walk. You logged your watch, you noted nothing unusual, and you climbed back down when your relief arrived. He was doing his job, and maybe that was enough. Just acknowledging it. Just letting him do what he'd always done. The thing that stays with me. The part I still turn over at night, 14 years later when October comes and the cold arrives fast without warning, is the last time I saw him. It was 3 days before we rotated out. I was in the tower alone, 0100, and the western lights were on, and he was walking his path the same way he always did. But this time, he stopped in the middle of his stretch. Just stopped mid-stride like someone had paused a recording. He stood there for a long moment, and then he turned and looked up at the tower. And he raised one hand, just slightly. Not a wave. Nothing theatrical. Nothing dramatic. More like an acknowledgement. The small, economical gesture of one soldier recognizing another. Like he'd known me the whole time. Like he'd known all of us. Each rotation, each scared kid in that plywood tower, and had simply been waiting until the end to say something. I didn't raise my hand back. I should have. I know I should have. But I was 22 years old, and I was scared in a way I didn't have a word for. And I just stood there, gripping the rail, until he turned away and kept walking. I've thought about that moment every year since. Every October. I think about Speck, Aaron Dillard walking his stretch of wire in a base that's been rebuilt around him twice over, that's housed 100 men who never knew his name, doing his rounds, keeping watch over something that maybe stopped mattering to anyone else a long time ago, but never stopped mattering to him. I don't know if that's comforting or terrifying. The first time it happened, Sergeant Bryce Holloway thought he miscounted. That's the most natural explanation, and I want to give it to him because Bryce was meticulous. The kind of NCO who caught discrepancies in supply manifests at a glance, who could tell you the name, rank, and bunk assignment of every man under his charge without looking at a clipboard. So, when he finished his morning count and came up one over, he started again from the left, counted down the line, reached the end. One extra. He called the number out to Lieutenant Decker standing beside him. Decker counted independently. Same result. 33 men in formation. 32 assigned to the unit. Bryce called names. Every man answered. All 32. He walked the line anyway. Slow, looking each soldier in the face. When he reached the back row, there was a man standing at the far right end of the line who he did not recognize. Medium height, desert fatigues, older pattern, the kind that had been phased out by the mid-2000s. Standing at parade rest, eyes forward, expression neutral. Bryce said later that the strange part wasn't the uniform or the face. It was that the man was slightly out of focus. Not blurred exactly, more like the way a figure looks when you catch it in your peripheral vision and turn to look directly at it, except it never sharpened. Even standing 5 feet away, looking straight at him, Bryce couldn't quite hold the details. He asked the man his name. No answer. He asked his unit, his rank, what he was doing in their formation. Nothing. Eyes forward, parade rest, still as a photograph. Bryce turned to say something to Decker. When he turned back, the man was gone. I'm Private First Class Marcus Webb. I was in that formation. I was 3 men down from where Bryce stopped and asked his questions, and I watched the whole thing without understanding what I was watching. From my angle, the man at the end of the line looked like any other soldier. I couldn't see anything wrong with him. But I noticed that Sergeant Holloway, who I had never once seen rattled, was standing very still with his hand partway raised, fingers open, like he'd been reaching for something and forgotten what it was. The second morning it happened, I was watching for it. I don't know exactly why. Something about the way Bryce had moved through the rest of that first day. Quiet, methodical, not saying what was bothering him, put me on edge. So the next morning, I took my position in the second row and I scanned the back of the formation before Bryce even started his count. He was there. Same position. Far right, back row. Same fatigues, same posture, same stillness. And from where I stood, maybe 12 feet back and to the left, I got a clearer look than Bryce had described. The man was real, solid, present, taking up space. But there was something wrong with the way the light hit him. The morning sun was coming in low and flat from the east, putting long shadows across the formation. Every man in that line had a shadow. I checked. I looked at each figure from left to right, tracing the shadow lines in the dust. He didn't have one. I stared at that patch of ground next to his boots for a long time. Pale dust, flat and unmarked, while every man around him cast a shadow 3 feet long pointing west. I checked twice, left to right, tracing each shadow in the dirt, confirming what I was seeing. 31 shadows. 32 men. My mouth went dry, and I had the irrational, urgent thought that I should look away before he noticed me looking. I looked back, up at his face. He was looking at me. Not at Sergeant Holloway starting his count at the front of the line, not forward, not at nothing. At me, specifically, with the quiet directness of someone who has been watching you for longer than you realized. His expression didn't change. Nothing about him changed. He just held my eyes for what felt like a long time, but was probably 4 seconds, steady and unhurried. And then his gaze moved forward again, like a door closing. I didn't say anything at formation. I didn't know how. By the end of the week, it wasn't just Bryce and me. Kowalski had seen him. Pruitt had seen him. A kid named Pharaoh from 3rd Squad said he'd tried to take a photo on his personal phone, pointed it at the back row during formation, and snapped 3 shots. When he checked them later, the back row was complete in all 3. 32 men, perfectly in focus. No one extra. No one missing. The figure simply wasn't there in the photographs, as though the camera couldn't see him at all. Bryce finally went to the chaplain on a Friday afternoon. I know because he asked me to come with him, and I think he asked me because I was the only other person he'd directly spoken to about it. Everyone else had been talking around it in the careful, circular way soldiers talk about things they don't have a category for, describing what they'd seen without naming what they thought it was. Father Caruso was a small, soft-spoken man from somewhere in Ohio who'd been a chaplain for 20 years and had the kind of steadiness you develop from sitting with people in the worst moments of their lives. He listened to everything Bryce described without interrupting. The miscount, the older fatigues, the way the man wouldn't focus, the lack of a shadow, the way he'd looked at me. When Bryce finished, Caruso was quiet for a moment. Then he asked one question. What did the uniform look like? Specifically, the pattern. Bryce described it. Caruso nodded slowly, like he was confirming something he'd already suspected, and then he stood up and went to a small shelf behind his desk where he kept a few personal items: a Bible, a photograph, a wooden cross. He picked up the photograph and looked at it for a moment before he handed it to Bryce. It was a unit photo. Older, the colors slightly faded, the resolution soft. A group of soldiers in formation, desert backdrop, squinting into sun. Caruso pointed to one figure in the back row. Is that him? He asked. Bryce looked at the photograph for a long time without speaking. Then he passed it to me. The man in the photograph was standing at parade rest, medium height, the same older uniform pattern, looking directly at the camera with the same neutral expression I'd seen across 30 feet of morning dust. The expression of a man who was simply present, simply waiting. That's him, I said. Caruso took the photograph back carefully, like it was something fragile. He told us the man's name was Corporal James Whitfield. He'd been stationed at this base, an earlier version of it, smaller before the expansions, in 1991. He'd collapsed during morning formation one February. Heart, they said. He was 26 years old. They'd tried everything, but by the time the medevac arrived, it was already over. He died during roll call, right there on that ground. Caruso said he'd known Whitfield briefly. Not well. Caruso had only been at the base a few weeks when it happened. But he remembered him as a soldier who took his duties seriously, who was always early, who was always in position before the count started. We didn't know what to say to that. Bryce sat with it for a moment, jaw tight, looking at the floor. Then he asked the question I think we were both carrying. Was there anything we should do? Caruso shook his head slowly. I don't think so, he said. I think he's just reporting in. The figure appeared at formation every morning for the remaining 4 months of our deployment. Bryce stopped recounting when the number came up one over. He just noted it, quietly, and moved on. After a while, the rest of us did too. You'd see him there, at the end of the back row if you looked, and most mornings you didn't look, because some things are easier to carry if you just let them be. On our last morning before rotation, Bryce did something I've never forgotten. He walked the line one final time after dismissal, slow, the way he always did. When he reached the back row, he stopped at the far right end. He stood at attention. And he saluted. I don't know if Whitfield saluted back. I wasn't close enough to see. But Bryce came back across the compound with his shoulders straight and his expression settled, and he didn't talk about it, and I didn't ask. Some things you just let be. It started as a maintenance complaint. That's the thing about FOB Harker. Everything unusual had a mundane explanation first. The base was old, patched together over 3 different occupations by 3 different units, and the electrical infrastructure reflected that history in the worst possible way. Breakers that tripped for no reason. Outlets that sparked when you looked at them wrong. Lights that hummed at frequencies that put your teeth on edge. So when Corporal Davies filed the first report saying the lights in the C block corridor were cutting out every night around 200, the base facilities guy shrugged, wrote it down, and said he'd get to it. He never got to it. I'm Private First Class Jordan Tate. I was billeted in C block for 7 months, and I want to be precise about the timeline because I've told this story before and people always think I'm exaggerating the buildup. I'm not. The lights went out every single night for 3 weeks before anyone took it seriously. 200 on the nose. The corridor lights, a single overhead strip running the length of the hallway between the 2 rows of bunk rooms, would flicker 3 times and go dark. Not a gradual fade. 3 distinct flickers, like a warning, and then nothing. They'd come back on their own somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes later. Nobody got up to check. It was 0200. You were asleep, or trying to be, and a hallway light cutting out wasn't worth losing sleep over when you had a 0530 PT formation waiting for you. The first week, it was just an inconvenience. The second week, it was just a pattern. By the third week, it was wallpaper, the kind of thing you stopped registering. It was Specialist Okafor who decided to document it. Okafor was that guy in every unit, methodical, slightly obsessive, convinced that every problem had a logical solution if you gathered enough data. He'd already spent 2 nights sitting in the corridor with a notepad, logging the exact time the lights cut out and came back on. 0201 and 0217 on the first night. 0200 and 0218 on the second. He told me the consistency was the part that bothered him. Faulty wiring doesn't run on a schedule. Faulty wiring is random. Whatever this was, it wasn't random. On the third night, he brought his phone. He set it up at the end of the corridor, propped against the base of the wall, angled to capture the full length of the hallway. Wide shot. He sat down the opposite end with his back against the door to his bunk room, facing the camera, and waited. He didn't have to wait long. At exactly 200, the lights flickered. Once, twice, 3 times. And on the third flicker, in that last half-second of light before the corridor went dark, Okafor said he saw something at the far end of the hallway that hadn't been there a moment before. A figure, standing at the wall. He said his first thought was that someone had stepped out of their bunk room without him hearing the door. That was the rational explanation. and he held onto it hard, because the alternative, the thing his body already understood before his brain caught up, was not something he was ready to accept in the dark at 0200 in a corridor that had just gone completely black. He sat still for the full 17 minutes the lights were out. He told me later it was the longest 17 minutes of his life. He couldn't see anything. He couldn't hear anything. No movement, no breathing, no shuffle of boots on the concrete floor. Just the ambient noise of the bass at night, the distant generator hum, the wind against the exterior walls, the occasional creak of the building settling, and the specific, suffocating quality of darkness in a space you know is not empty. When the lights came back on, the corridor was clear. No figure, no one standing at the wall, every bunk room door still closed. He checked the footage immediately. The video opened on the empty corridor, the overhead strip light washing everything in flat white. Okafor was visible at the far end, sitting against the door, legs stretched out. The timestamp ticked upward in the corner. At 200:04 the lights flickered. Once, twice, 3 times. And on the third flicker, in the frame just before the video went dark, there it was. A figure at the near end of the corridor. Right where Okafor had set the phone. Facing the wall. Not facing the camera. Not facing down the hall. Pressed close to the wall. At the corridor's end. Face forward. Like someone standing in a corner they'd been sent to. The figure was in uniform. Okafor couldn't make out the pattern in the low light of that last flicker, but the silhouette was clear. Shoulders square, arms at the sides. Perfectly, absolutely still. Then the footage went dark for 17 minutes. 17 minutes of black screen and ambient noise. And then the lights came back on, and the corridor was empty again, and Okafor was still sitting at the far end, knees up, staring at the space where the figure had been. He came to my bunk at 02:30 and woke me up to show me the footage. I watched it 4 times. I kept stopping on that last frame before the lights went out, zooming in trying to get the detail to resolve. The figure never got clearer. The compression, the low light, the half-second exposure all worked against me. But the shape was unambiguous. Someone standing at the wall. Someone who had not been in that corridor 1 second before. I asked Okafor what he wanted to do. He said he wanted to go back the next night and set up closer. I told him that was a terrible idea. He agreed. We went anyway. The 4th night, we sat together at the midpoint of the corridor, equidistant from both ends, with Okafor's phone propped against the wall beside us, angled toward the far end where the figure had stood. We didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say. We sat in the flat, white light and watched the timestamp tick toward 0200, and I was aware of every door in that corridor in a way I'd never been before. 6 bunkroom doors, 3 on each side. All closed. All still. At 0200 the lights flickered once. Twice. I grabbed Okafor's arm without meaning to. 3 times. Dark. I felt rather than saw Okafor go rigid beside me. His breathing changed. Shallow. Controlled. The breathing of someone trying to make no sound at all. I did the same. We sat in complete blackness, and I kept my eyes pointed at the far end of the corridor even though I could see nothing. Even though seeing nothing was somehow worse than whatever I might have seen, because at least seeing something would have told me where it was. Then I heard it. One footstep. Single. Deliberate. Close. Much closer than the far end of the corridor. Maybe 10 feet away. The sound of a boot sole on concrete. Careful and slow. Like someone placing their weight down with great intention. Then, nothing. I did not move. Okafor did not move. We sat in that dark for the full 15 minutes until the lights came back and the corridor was empty and every door was still closed and there was no one there and the phone was recording, and when we checked the footage, there was nothing on it but us. Nothing at that end of the corridor. Nothing in the space where the sound had come from. The camera had captured an empty hallway for 15 minutes, and then the lights coming back on, and 2 soldiers sitting against the wall, looking like they'd aged 10 years. Whatever was in that corridor, it knew where the camera was. We told Sergeant Holloway the next morning. He listened, watched the original footage twice, and didn't say much. That afternoon, he put in a second maintenance request for the C-block corridor lighting. That one got addressed. A contractor came through, replaced a section of wiring, declared the issue resolved. The lights went out at 200 the very next night. 3 flickers. 17 minutes. Back on. We stopped trying to document it after that. Some things don't want to be recorded. Some things just want to be left alone in the dark, doing whatever it is they do in the 17 minutes between the lights going out and coming back on. I never found out who the figure was. I never tried very hard. I think I already understood, on some level, that knowing wouldn't help. Knowing the name wouldn't change the footage, wouldn't change the sound of that one deliberate footstep in the dark. What I know is this. Every night at 0200, something in C-block corridor stands at that wall and faces it and waits. For what? I couldn't tell you. Maybe it's waiting for the lights to come back on. Maybe it's waiting for something else entirely. I shipped out 4 months later and I never went back. But sometimes, at 200, I wake up for no reason I can name. And I lie there in the dark, and I listen. And I try very hard not to think about what might be standing at the end of the hall. There were 5 of us. That's how these stories always start, I think. A small group. Close enough to trust each other. Far enough from home that the trust means something. We were all fresh. New unit. New deployment. New country. None of us had been stationed abroad before. We'd gone through the same processing cycle, shipped out on the same manifest, and by the time we landed at FOB Archer in the late summer heat of wherever we were, we'd already started becoming something. Not quite friends yet, but the kind of people who eat together because the alternative is eating alone. My name isn't important. Call me Tate, same as everyone did. The others were Delgado, who was from San Antonio and talked about his mother's cooking with a reverence most people reserve for religion. Osei, who was quiet and deliberate and read paperback thrillers so fast you'd swear he was skimming them, but could quote any passage you pointed to. Reyes, who laughed at everything, including things that weren't funny, which sounds annoying but was actually the thing that kept us sane on the long afternoons. And Calloway, Marcus Calloway. I want to say his name clearly because I think he deserves that much. FOB Archer was small and slow. Our assignment was support, logistics mostly, with occasional convoy escorts that broke the routine without really relieving it. Between rotations, there was a lot of nothing. Heat and dust, and the particular kind of boredom that comes from being somewhere unfamiliar with nothing to do. We watched movies on Osei's laptop until we'd seen everything twice. We played cards until Delgado's consistent winning made it less fun. We worked out. We wrote letters. We slept more than grown men probably should. The rumors about the base were already there when we arrived. Older soldiers passed them along the way. They pass everything, sideways, casually, in the middle of conversations about other things, as though the information was incidental when it clearly wasn't. There had been an incident in the Eastern Bloc 3 deployments back. Something no one would specify beyond a vague reference to a soldier who had to be medevaced out for reasons that weren't medical, exactly. The motor pool had a section the mechanics avoided after dark, not officially, not in any posted order, just by the unspoken consensus of men who had learned something without wanting to know what they'd learned. There was a particular frequency you'd sometimes catch on the comms equipment late at night, voices in a language nobody could identify, speaking with a cadence that didn't match any regional dialect the interpreters recognized. One of the older comms guys said it had been logged twice, and both times the report came back. Atmospheric interference. Unexplained. No further action required. Standard base mythology, we told ourselves. The kind every FOB accumulates over years of scared young men with too much time and too little light. Every base has its stories. Every base has its dead corners and its avoided rooms, and its sounds the official record doesn't know what to do with. We were new. We were skeptical. We had the confident skepticism of people who had not yet been given a reason to believe. We didn't take it seriously. That was our first mistake. The board was Delgado's idea, which surprised all of us, because Delgado wore a rosary every day without exception and attended chapel whenever the chaplain came through. He pulled it out one dead Wednesday evening, a folded piece of cardboard he'd apparently made himself, letters and numbers in his own handwriting, a coin for the planchette, and set it on the floor of the common room with the particular energy of a man who has been sitting with a bad idea long enough that it started sounding good. Reyes said immediately he was in. Osei looked at it for a moment and said nothing, which we all understood as reluctant participation. I looked at Calloway. Calloway shook his head. I'm not doing that. You're Catholic, Reyes has said. Delgado's Catholic. Delgado made the thing. Which is how I know better, Calloway said. Delgado shrugged. We're in a Muslim country. Different rules. Different spirits. We'll be fine. Even Calloway laughed at that, which was probably the moment the decision got made. You can't laugh at something and then maintain a principled objection to it. He sat down. We all sat down. 5 soldiers in a poorly lit common room, knees touching, fingers on a coin, in a country none of us were from, on a base built over ground that had been contested for longer than any of us had been alive. The first 3 nights produced nothing. The coin didn't move. Or rather, it moved the way things move when 5 people are touching something and trying to hold perfectly still, the tiny, involuntary tremors of human contact. Nothing purposeful. Nothing that felt like anything other than 5 bored men sitting on a floor making themselves slightly uncomfortable for no reward. Reyes declared it fake after night 2. Osei said he'd known that from the start. Delgado seemed almost relieved. Calloway said nothing, just cleaned the coin and tucked it in his pocket, which I thought was a strange thing to do. We went back on night 4 because there was nothing else to do. I don't know how to describe the shift when it happened, except to say that we all felt it simultaneously. One moment the coin was inert under our fingers, collective dead weight, going nowhere, and the next it was moving with a quality that was different from before. Not faster, not more dramatic, just different. There is a specific sensation when something moves because it wants to versus something moved because someone is pushing it. And in that moment, every one of us felt the distinction at the same time because every one of us went quiet at the same time without anyone saying a word. The coin moved to yes. Delgado asked if someone was with us. Yes again. Ose asked its name. The coin moved, slowly, deliberately, to letters that didn't form anything recognizable. Not a name any of us knew. A sequence. Reyes wrote it down. I still remember the way his hand was shaking when he did. We asked how it died. The coin moved to letters again. We asked how long it had been here. It moved to numbers. We asked if it knew where it was. Yes. We asked if it wanted something from us. Long pause. Then, here. Just that. Here. We stopped for the night shortly after. Nobody suggested stopping. It just happened, the collective sense that we'd reached a limit without being able to say where the limit was. We cleaned up, turned the lights back on, didn't talk much before bed. Reyes made a joke, but it was a smaller joke than usual, and nobody laughed the way they normally would. We kept going back. 5 more nights over the following 2 weeks. Each session, the responses came faster, the movements more certain. We learned, or believed we learned, that whatever we were speaking to had been on that ground for a very long time. Longer than the base. Longer than the conflict. It answered some questions and deflected others. It seemed more responsive to Calloway than to the rest of us. When Calloway's fingers were on the coin, it moved with a particular fluency that wasn't there when he stepped back. We told ourselves it meant nothing. He had steady hands, less involuntary tremor. There was always an explanation. The first thing we noticed was the formations. Calloway had never once been late. In 3 months of shared service, I could not remember a single instance of him missing a mark. He was the kind of soldier who arrived early and stood waiting, which made the rest of us look lazy by comparison. So when he showed up to 0600 formation 30 seconds after Sergeant Brandt started the count, disheveled and slightly unfocused, we registered it the way you register a wrong note in a familiar song. Not alarming yet, just wrong. It happened again 2 days later, then 3 times in 1 week. Brandt counseled him. Calloway took it without argument, which was itself strange. The Calloway we knew would have had an explanation ready, not from arrogance, but from the genuine orderliness of the way he moved through the world. He just absorbed the counseling and said, "Yes, Sergeant," and walked away with his eyes slightly off to the side, focused on something the rest of us couldn't see. He stopped eating with us. Not dramatically. He'd come to the chow hall, take a tray, sit at the end of the table and push the food around without really eating it. He stopped laughing at Reyes's jokes. He stopped responding to Delgado's questions about what he wanted for his first meal back home. He'd stopped sleeping well, or so it seemed from the state of him in the mornings. Eyes slightly sunken, the look of a man who had been somewhere all night that wasn't rest. His bunk looked slept in, but his face didn't look rested, and when you asked him directly, he'd say, "Fine, I'm fine," with the flat affect of someone for whom fine had stopped meaning anything. Osei was the first to say out loud what the rest of us were circling. He came to my bunk one evening and sat down and said, without preamble, "It's the board." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. I had been sitting with the same thought for a week, turning it over, looking for the angle that made it not true. There wasn't one. Whatever was happening to Calloway had started the night the coin first moved under his fingers with that different quality, and it had been accumulating since then, like water rising in a room too slowly to trigger alarm, until suddenly you noticed it was at your chest. We stopped the sessions. Unanimously, without a formal conversation, we just stopped. The board didn't come out again. The coin stayed wherever Calloway had put it. We told each other it was unrelated. None of us believed that. The night it came to a head was a Tuesday. I remember because we'd just gotten mail, and I'd been reading a letter from my sister when Delgado knocked on my door with a look on his face I'd never seen before. Not fear exactly, but the particular expression of someone who has just heard a sound they don't have a category for. He said Calloway was in the common room. I heard it before I reached the door. A sound that I will not describe in full because I don't think I have the right words, and because the ones I do have seem too large for a single human voice in a small room. What I will say is that it was Calloway's voice, and also not Calloway's voice. The pitch wrong, the cadence wrong, the language wrong, cycling through something that wasn't any language I'd ever heard, in the way you'd cycle through radio frequencies, searching for something that wasn't there. He was standing in the center of the room when we entered, not moving, arms at his sides, face tipped slightly upward, eyes open, but focused on nothing in this room, or possibly this world. His mouth producing that sound with no visible effort, no breath that I could detect, no indication that the thing driving his voice had any interest in the body it was using. Reyes grabbed his shoulder. Calloway turned and looked at him. And I want to be precise, because this matters. He didn't look at Reyes the way you look at someone you know. He looked at Reyes the way you look at a door. Recognition without relationship. An obstacle, or an exit, or simply a thing that was in the way. We called the medics. Calloway didn't resist when they arrived. He went quiet the moment they came through the door. The sound just stopped, like a switch thrown, like the lights in C-block corridor, and he let them lead him out with the same flat compliance he'd given Sergeant Brandt's counseling. He didn't look back at us. That was the last time I saw Marcus Calloway. The official record said, medical transfer. Destination unspecified. We asked Brandt, who asked someone above him, who asked someone above him, and each time the answer came back the same. Transferred, location restricted, no further information available. Delgado tried writing to the address on Calloway's personnel file, the family home in Georgia, the one he'd mentioned a few times, the one with the big oak tree out front his mother refused to cut down. The letter came back, unopened. No forwarding address. We didn't know if that meant Calloway had never made it home, or simply that he had made it home and wanted the distance. I still don't know. I've chosen, over the years, to believe the latter, because the former is a thing I can't carry cleanly. We finished our deployment as 4. We didn't talk about Calloway much, not because we didn't think about him. I believe we all thought about him constantly, in the way you think about an unhealed thing. But because talking about him meant talking about the board, and talking about the board meant saying out loud what we'd all already understood. It was Osei who finally put words to it, on our last night before rotation. We were sitting outside the common room in the dark, the 4 of us doing the things soldiers do at the end of a deployment where you sit together without any particular reason and nobody feels compelled to fill the silence. He said, "There's a version of us that never got bored enough to try it, and in that version, Marcus goes home the same way he arrived." Nobody answered him. There was nothing useful to say. After a while, Delgado spoke. "I think the hardest thing about being human," he said, "is that we reach for connection even in places where we should let the dark stay dark. We can't help it. It's the same instinct that makes us good to each other, and sometimes it opens doors we don't know how to close. I've turned that over for years." I think he was right. The same thing that made 5 strangers into something like a unit, the reaching, the need to not be alone in an unfamiliar place, was the thing that put a coin on a piece of cardboard and asked what was there. We just didn't know, until it was too late, that something was listening, and that some doors, once opened, don't close the same way twice. And that's where we leave it tonight. Midnight members. Soldiers who never stopped walking their post. A formation that always counts one too many. A corridor that goes dark for 17 minutes every single night, for reasons no one has ever explained. And 5 friends who reached for company in the dark and found something that was already waiting. These are the stories that don't end clean. The man on the perimeter is probably still walking it, even now, in the dark, on a base that's changed hands a dozen times since he last drew breath. Whatever stands in that corridor is probably still standing there right now, at this very hour, facing the wall, waiting for the lights to fail again. And somewhere out there, Marcus Calloway is either home, healing, trying to forget, or he isn't. We'll never know. Some things, once they happen overseas, simply stay there. They don't follow you home, and they don't let you fully leave them behind either. That's the nature of this kind of fear. It doesn't need a resolution to stay with you. It just needs a little room to settle in. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere you'll think about it again the next time the lights flicker for no reason at all. If you enjoyed this episode, why don't you watch another? Just click on the next episode on your screen. There's more waiting for you in the dark. Until next time, Midnight members. Good night, Midnight members. Sleep well if you can.